Yeah. Because the only part of this that I was involved in was the library.
Right.
The first building. This.
Mm-hmm.
That. Not that.
Okay, okay. So that came first. I
This
didn't
was
realize that those were two phases.
Yes, this was the first phase of the whole thing.
Mm-hmm.
And then that, I don't know when that was built, but I had left to Dublin.
Well, have you been in that?
I have, yeah.
Well, that's kind of like classrooms and a sequence of
Yes.
sort of rooms rather than...
Yes, it's an odd place.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, but the library is beautiful.
The
We were
library's
really
beautiful.
admiring these columns.
Yes.
Is that blockwork?
Blockwork and brick.
Yeah, combined.
Yeah. So we were trying to make a brick building because Shane was of course mad about bricks at that time, and so was I.
Okay.
With as few bricks as possible, because bricks are expensive.
Right.
They're more expensive than they were at that time. More expensive than block.
So that would have been the brief to build a brick building with this little.
Well, no, it was what we wanted.
Yeah. Okay.
What he wanted to do very much, and I was at one with that certainly.
And so you were there for how many years?
I joined the practice in 1990 and I left in 1995. So I was there for 5 years.
Okay.
And
5 years is a solid period.
yes,
Yeah. And informative years, presumably, as well.
Well, I was already. So I left UCD in 1981.
Okay.
And Shane was one of my teachers.
Mm-hmm.
So I was very influenced by him as a student, I would say.
Mm-hmm. Were you there when he brought Louis Kahn when Louis Kahn came to Dublin?
No, I wasn't. That was in the 70s, I think.
Okay.
Yeah. Kahn was actually, he died in 1977. Okay. No. When did he die?
I'm not sure.
Because I started in UCD in 1975.
Okay. Well, I was talking to Sheila O'Donnell, and she was saying how I think she must have been, and this is Shane O'Toole doing this maths. I spoke to him as well, and so he said she could have only been maybe first year when Louis Kahn came to Dublin. But what she said was that it was remarkable kind of hearing Kahn speak, because she realized that Shane was Kahn. And of course Shane O'Toole actually said that that's absolutely not the case. He disagreed very much. So it's interesting that people have different recollections. So I wondered maybe what would have been your kind of reading of that.
Yes. No, so Shane O'Toole and Sheila are a few years older than me. So maybe they were in first year. But after I left UCD, I went to New York and I worked there. And then much later, with a colleague and friend, Robert Hayes, who qualified with me in Dublin, we were going to make a series of films, documentaries, but we ended up making one film about Kahn. It was basically about the Salk Institute. So I've looked at a lot of footage of Kahn for that reason, speaking and all of that. And of course, he was a really inspiring speaker. Yes. And would be very unexpected in his answers to students. And,
So a little bit of an entertainer. Yeah,
or, I remember once there's some footage of him giving a talk. I don't remember where it is, to a huge, theatre of students, and at the end there are questions, and this is kind of 1970s or late 1960s, and a girl in the audience asks him if a building is a bit like a fairy tale. And, I was expecting the answer to be kind of, I don't know what I was expecting, but anyway, he went on to say, Yes, a building is very much a fairy tale. And he talked about how, I think that's the point where he talks about his interest in ruins, you know, because he says when a building is, when it's functioning, you know, when it's functioning as it should, it's doing all the things that are required of it. It's in the mundane world, if you will, and then afterwards, when it becomes a ruin, it's the true essence of the building comes out, you know. And he said, then the building is saying, you know, the way he talked about buildings say this, say that.
Things, yeah.
The building is saying, look at this place, look at that place.
Wow.
Yeah, and it was really kind of a remarkable answer.
And you did a documentary on Salk Institute.
Yes. So Robert and I had this idea, that you know, it would be a way of teaching to make documentaries about buildings, and this is before video had been developed, but not the digital technology that we have now. We decided that the first one would be the Salk Institute because it was so kind of remarkable, the sighting of it and all of that on the Pacific. And but then because of that, we sort of looked at a number of his buildings and we interviewed people along the way, like Carlos Vollenrath. He'd been the project architect for that building. And I forget who else. Oh yeah, Alexander Ting and her mother. And yeah, it was really very interesting.
And what did you film the Salk Institute as well?
We did. We filmed the Salk Institute and we interviewed people, and we found out very quickly that it's very difficult to film buildings. Mm-hmm. You probably have realized this because they don't move. So you're very aware of the camera, and we really didn't, you know, we were absolute amateurs. We really didn't know what we were doing. But then at certain points we had enough money to have a professional crew. Mm-hmm. So yeah, it was very interesting. It was particularly interesting doing the research for it, and talking to the people, and we went to the University of Pennsylvania and the library there and the Kahn archive.
And so you did that as a kind of independent project?
Yeah, we did that as an independent project, and we were very, we thought maybe that we would make other films, and we did some research on Eileen Gray, for example, but that didn't transpire. You know, it didn't end up that we did that. But it was very interesting doing it.
And is this film available in the public?
It is actually. Well, it's distributed by the University of California.
Uh-huh.
It's called Spent Light.
Mm-hmm. I must find that.
Yeah. Which comes from something that Kahn said as well. We are made of spent light.
Right. It's because I hope to go and actually see. I have been to the Salk Institute, but I hope to go and see the Paul Mellon Center, and as well as the library in
Exeter.
Yeah. But hope potentially as part of this project, because I feel like if I'm tracing influence in some way, I think so much of it in Shane, and if Shane is like a trigger for the conversation, I think then actually going back to look at Kahn, but I'm trying to justify myself going so far to film a little bit of architecture, and do you think it was important going to Salk Institute and kind of looking at it, like really looking at
it? I think it was very important, probably for us at the time. In a certain way, I think you probably should, especially if Kahn is a big part of this. The thing that struck me, I don't know if I should say this if you're going to go, but what struck me about seeing his buildings in America was that they look, in the photographs and in the drawings, they look very monumental. But when you go there, they don't feel monumental. They don't feel in any way, they feel very human, and almost kind of modest, you know, and I really liked that, but I was surprised by it. The one building that didn't seem like that, I was in Dhaka once, and I went to see that building, which is extraordinary. It does feel monumental, but it probably should. It is the Parliament building. So I think maybe in that sense you should go and see his buildings, because it's the experience of being there is so different from seeing them on in paper, on paper or in drawings.
But also I guess framing, you know, of course Exeter Library, everyone, you always get that framing of that circle, but like that's not it, right? It's actually probably, if you zoom into the circle, there'll be something a bit more interesting.
Yes, and of course you're seeing it through the photographer's eye.
Absolutely.
I was in Dhaka, that was in 1996 or something, and I remember thinking, beforehand when I looked at the photographs, you see these beautiful photographs, and women in saris, you know, walking in their bare feet, or the men walking in the long white robes, carrying, you know, rushes or baskets, and I had thought that the photographs were posed, you know, they weren't. When I got there, I realized, no, it's actually like this. It was then, anyway. But that's nearly 30 years ago.
And that building, I think, I mean, I've read that it's particularly kind of not in a great kind of condition. Possibly.
Yes.
The climate, of course, of that region. And
still wonderful, though.
Yeah. And film as a medium, Mary, is that something that's interests you, or something in relation to architecture?
Well, yeah, it's interesting because that was at the very beginning of my career that myself and Robert did that. And then just recently for the Venice Biennale, I was involved in the film. So one of the islands, Inishmaan, was, we showed it through film. So we made a 15-minute film, and it's one day in the life of Inishmaan. It's black and white. And I had it was very different. I had a full film crew, Red Pepper, you know, doing that with me.
And were you the director?
I'm not called the director. The director is Martin Daniels. I think they're calling me the producer. But the Venice team, we decided what it should be. We were very clear about what it should be beforehand. And Red Pepper were fantastic, and we worked with them very closely.
And are they the ones that are doing this long film?
Yes.
Yes.
They're making a film. They've made it, in fact. It's
yes.
about the making of the In Search of Hy-Brasil pavilion. It's called Eglurug Hy-Brasil, which means In Search of Hy-Brasil in Irish.
And so, Mary, you said that you've practiced for many years, and now you're sort of teaching more, or I'm interested in how you see teaching as, I don't want to say a form of practice, but does it ever become a form of practice, or I guess how is it connected, and how do you maintain it connected? Because again, there's always this question of education being kind of away from the practice.
Yes.
So how have you always taught?
Not always, but I've probably taught for the last 25 years when I was practicing and teaching. And that's quite, it's demanding, but that's the model that we have, you know, in UCD architecture and in many other schools of architecture in Britain and America. It's more a kind of Anglo-American model, which I think is a good model, but it's quite difficult to do it. At the same time, if you're a small practice and you're a design practice, having the teaching work is so important, both in terms of giving you stability, but also allowing you to stay connected to the world of ideas and because architectural practice, as you know, is a business, and it's a profession, and
it's rarely discursive.
Yeah, and it's very demanding.
Yeah.
So if you're also teaching, it helps you to stay balanced in that way, but it is very demanding on your time. What I think is happening now, though, is that, you see, everything, well, no matter what your discipline is now, it is overshadowed by the climate emergency and the planetary crisis. And so teaching has got to be absolutely at the cold face of that. But we're finding that very difficult, because how do you teach that when you don't really know yourself how to build in a post-carbon environment? But we're all learning very fast how to do that. We're having to learn very fast. And students are, young people obviously are very interested in that, and that they're also finding it all very difficult because of the,
Well, it's paralyzing.
Yeah, paralyzing, and people feel despair. And in terms of building, how do we build now? I mean, Kahn and the stone of modern man, concrete, he said, is the stone of modern man. And we can't use it anymore after 2050. It was the miraculous material of the 20th century, but it's, I don't know the figures, but it's one of the most carbon intensive materials that we use. And we use, and so much of our building materials and our building methods demand high energy and high temperatures that fossil fuels have given us. So I think we are already looking back to the vernacular, because how did people build before fossil fuels? They did build, actually,
Yeah, but I think there's also a problem with that as well, in going to vernacular. We've actually, I found myself with my students going to vernacular, kind of timber and stone and mud and but there's a certain limit to what's achievable with those materials, as well as like producing a certain kind of architectural language that is slightly, it's interesting to kind of bring it into contemporary discourse, but it also is a little bit strange that we're sort of ending up with like stone huts and
but we're learning from the vernacular. It doesn't mean that it's going to have the same expression. I mean, there are some people doing very interesting work. Like those people in Mallorca. We were on a study trip there in doing social housing using local stone and low temperatures, very high quality architecture, very low carbon. Maybe it's even zero carbon, I'm not sure. The thing is that we are probably having to try all methods and to look and to really we're having to question the way we thought about architecture in the 20th century. That's what we're reviewing.
I wonder whether that puts us in a difficult position in terms of how we talk about Kahn, how we talk about Le Corbusier, how do we talk about modernist movement, and can we still just look at the spaces and the qualities of space and detail, or do we judge, or do we
well, yes, I mean, recently was at a talk by Kiel Mo, and he's written about the Seagram building, and it's still an extraordinary work of architecture. We don't say it's not.
Yes,
it is.
Yes, it always will be.
Yeah, but and it was built in a different time. But when you look at the reality of what that building cost, not in money, but in real terms. You have to question that method, for us anyway, you know. It's very challenging.
Yeah.
The whole thing is very challenging, but yes, so at a certain point in my career, well, what I did was I did a master's in conservation, in urban and building conservation, but I chose as my subject, my thesis subject, the dry stone walls of the Aran Islands. And so that led me in a completely different direction. And so I was very, you know, that kind of changed my direction, because I began to think then about much more about landscape, not so much landscape design, but cultural landscape, the relationship between the natural world and human beings. And the more, you know, life goes on, the more I see that as the sort of crux and at the center really of our difficulty is our relationship to the natural world, which has just kind of gone askew. And we're all realizing that now, but it's very difficult to reset. But reset, we will have to reset.
So a lot of your interest there's a lot of interest in landscape, perhaps?
Yes, I'm interested in landscape, but I'm also interested in this relationship, this nature-culture relationship.
And was that in any way explored in the Irish Pavilion?
Well, yes, that's kind of what it's about, you know, because it's so it's responding to the theme of the Biennale, partly the laboratory of the future, decolonization and decarbonization. But it's also about it's about the future of the island of Ireland, but looking at our islands to understand that, because islands are more remote places. So there's a sharper sort of edge to the whole thing.
It's clearer.
It's clearer.
Well, they're a microcosm.
They are microcosms.
We always read macrocosms in microcosms.
Yes. Yes, and in fact, there's a direct relationship. Matthew Jebb, who's the botanist, was talking about how, because one of the things that we showed was the Clare Island survey, and there were two surveys, one at the end of the 19th century and one at the end of the 20th century, and if you compare the two, there's been something like 25% loss of biodiversity, and biodiversity apparently is directly related to land mass. So the larger the land mass, the greater biodiversity. I suppose it's obvious maybe when you look at but when we look at that microcosm of Clare Island and survey it, and we find that there's been 25% loss, it means that there's been probably 25% loss in the bigger island, if not more. You know, so yes, and then they're also dealing with, well, certainly the islands in the Atlantic are dealing with climate adversity all the time, and scarce
much more
resources.
Extreme,
The Aran Islands in particular are, they are dealing with scarcity of resources. There's very little soil there, so they have found ways to make soil. You know, they have developed resilience because of their situation. So that's why we can learn from them. So that was
that resilience comes from rethinking the relationship to the land, or learning from nature.
Yes. Yes. Or learning to have a balanced relationship with nature, and not to consider the earth as the way things are now. We consider the earth as simply there for our use. We extract as much as we can. Our farming systems give us the highest yield. This is always what we're looking for, the absolute highest yield. But you know, it's a finite resource.
So that curation of that pavilion. Have you done anything in Venice before?
Before that, I was involved in Venice when the Grafton Architects were the curators. With Eva Nivaran, we were part of Close Encounters.
Mm-hmm.
And we interpreted the Jean Renaudie housing in Paris. Yes. Yeah. And then this time, Peter Cody and Peter Carroll were. Have you spoken to either of them?
Peter Carroll. Yes.
Peter Carroll, yeah. They had been thinking about islands before this, and they were and they asked me to be involved.
Done some work. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, because all the five of us have some relationship with islands. Mm-hmm. You know, Joseph was involved with Joseph Mackey, was involved with Clare, Cape Clear, and Elizabeth Hatz was involved with Inishmaan. Mm-hmm. So all of us in some way are involved with islands, and they asked me to be involved, which was really delightful working with them, and it was just such a nice project.
And that was a kind of a mixture of research, presentation, design.
Yeah.
There was so much, such a kind of multifaceted project.
Yes.
You know, I wonder how these Biennale gigs, they actually allow so much.
They do, yeah.
They're maybe the sort of an exhibition design in general, I guess.
Yeah.
It's something that brings together practice and research and teaching.
Yes. Yes. And I suppose architectural exhibition is a particular thing, you know, because we're still thinking like architects, of course.
I know.
And we're
so it's rarely done well. I'd say.
Yeah, well, we're thinking about the room, the space, the context, all of that, you know, as well as the exhibits. Well, I learned an awful lot from the rest of because of the theme and because there was so much input from the non-European world, you know. I mean, the European ones were interesting, very much interesting too, but...
And Venice? Is Venice like an important place?
Well, I know I've heard Peter Cody talk about how, you know, those islands in Venice, they were built by people who didn't have land. So there you are kind of making use of resources by, you know, building, by having to, let's say, which is what we're faced with now. So there are loads of things to learn from Venice. I think that's for sure. Yeah, it's become important. That Biennale has become important because there's so much work being shown there, and
it's kind of main thing we have, where we as a profession. I mean, there's like biennales everywhere, and so design weeks and things like that. Yes. But it's really Venice Biennale is not like in the art world. I feel there is a lot more like triennales, documenta. There's so much.
Probably, yeah.
But in our field, it's quite focused on that.
Yeah. Especially if it takes more radical themes. If it's just a way of, you know, all the star architects showing their wares, then it's not so interesting, because you can go and look at the buildings and, you know. But I mean, there's still things to learn, of course. Yeah. But if there's a radical theme and a theme that's really questioning the difficulties that we're being challenged with, then I think it is important, yeah.
So when I spoke to Shane, the first thing he wanted to talk about was Dublin. So then it was like, well, you know, before any question, before anything, well, you need to understand this is the old city, this is that. You need to see this street, Henrietta Street is important, this is important, the park is important. And so he took us on this 3.5 hours ride around Dublin. It was incredible. Yeah.
In a car?
In a car, yeah. And it was pouring rain, so we couldn't really get out. So we just ended up in the car. We didn't go to Casino Marina, which of course he always, I think he talks about in his lectures. But we kind of circled a lot around,
Yeah.
I guess, just quite a small area of central Dublin for 3 hours. And so I wonder whether for you, like, that's something that you would say is really important for, well, not in terms of reading his architecture, but just understanding Irish architecture. And whether it's important or not, what do you think it is important about Dublin to understand the wider architectural culture or culture of Ireland?
Well, it's a big question, and there are a lot of people talking about that, I imagine. Yeah, it's interesting, you know, one of the things we did with the In Search of Ibrazil is we said we're looking west. In Ireland, particularly in the architectural and urban world of Ireland, we're always looking east towards Dublin and London and Europe. But with that pavilion said, no, we're looking west. We're going to look at the islands and the landscape and the rural world. And in a sense, that's what I was doing when I was looking at the dry stone walls of the Aran Islands. I was actually turning my back on Dublin urbanism and saying, wait a minute, what about this? In fact, those islands are built landscapes because they are made with human hand. The walls, you know, are built as, I don't know if you know them, but there's lots of small fields and lots of walls, which is the glacial debris scattered across the landscape that's been made into walls. But the actual fields are made with human hands as well, because the soil cover it's a limestone geology, and it's so thin that they had to make soil. So they gather seaweed and sand from the shore, they mix it together with a little bit, there is shale there which supports a little bit of indigenous soil. They mix it together and they make a field. And then they sow potatoes in it. Just talking with somebody this morning about potatoes, potatoes have this extraordinary thing that when you plant them, they break up the soil. So they make fertile soil. By growing potatoes, you make fertile soil. If you have a back garden in London.
That. Yeah. No, I don't. I have a very bare patio without any grass.
So what you're looking at is a deeply humanized landscape. Really, we call it a cultural landscape. Deeply, profoundly humanized. You're actually looking at a built landscape. And yet it is completely in harmony, let's say, with the natural world. It's using natural resources, saving rainwater, gathering the glacial debris to make, gathering seaweed, gathering sand. It's really human beings working in conjunction with nature to make a life. So that's kind of the direction that I have been in. However, all this time I've been living here in Dublin, in north.
In this house?
In this house, yeah. I've been living here since 1987. We're in the North City Centre, the inner city, and this is part of the North Georgian core, what's left of it. So yeah, I mean, I also love Dublin. It may be true, it probably is true, that in order to understand Irish architecture, you have to, understand the city and what's made the city and all of that. I find myself always wanting to have a deeper and longer perspective that goes further back through time than the city of Dublin. This house was built in 1789, and before the time Luke Gardner and the Gardner estate, these were just meadows. So this is later part of the city than Shane was probably showing you around the medieval core. where his office is.
I think we would have
It's
driven through here as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I am interested in all of that. Obviously, I'm interested in conservation and historic buildings, and I suppose I'm, when I look back through time to the Neolithic in Ireland, or the field monuments of the Bronze Age, which you have on Arran and throughout the country, in fact, all over the country. And then medieval times, the early medieval, and I see a really good understanding of siting and of landscape and how you build in the landscape, like the medieval cathedral of Armagh, for example, which is in the north. It's the ecclesiastical capital. The medieval cathedral of Armagh is built on a kind of hill, and then the city of Armagh is goes around it, and even today those streets curve around it, curve around the medieval cathedral. The complex of Cashel, the Rock of Cashel, these are sort of iconic things that you see in the tourist books about Ireland. But all of those have an understanding about landscape and where you build.
And presumably the process of building is in time, and it has a sort of consideration of time is greater.
Yes,
because those things would have taken generations.
Generations, yeah, hundreds of years sometimes. And even if you look
at it's a collective thing.
It's a collective thing, yes. And it's very much part of the society, and it reflects the society. The thing that strikes me often about George in Dublin is how short-lived it was. Because this part of the city, the North Georgian core, was built, between 1750 and probably about 1800, or maybe 1820. Some of the houses up there were built a little later, but already by 1801 was the Act of Union, and so George in Dublin began to go downhill. That was when the Parliament moved from Ireland to London. The Anglo-Irish Parliament ended, and so this part of the city in particular, because this was the aristocratic part, Parnell Square, which is just down here, there was a survey in 1798, just before the Act of Union, and right here was the richest parish in Dublin. We were the parish of St. George, which is the finest neoclassical church in Dublin. Is just out there. I can show you the spire by Francis Johnson, St. George's. And the parish of St. George was the richest parish in Dublin, and today it's probably the poorest. It no longer exists, really, the parish of St. George, but this area is very poor now, very multicultural, and so it was very short-lived. That was a really short space of time. I think Henrietta Street was built in 1730, and Luke Gardner's grandfather, the first Luke Gardner, lived there and built that. And by 1800, it was beginning to go downhill.
Yes, and it was used as an orphan. Those houses are very sort of derelict.
Very derelict. Henrietta Street, marvellous houses. Yeah. If you get a chance, go to see.
Well, I went to see the museum.
There's a museum,
but it's not. It's bare. There's nothing in it.
Yeah, there's nothing in it. Yeah.
So they're telling a story, but it's a bit like, well, there's nothing.
Yes, except that you can see the house.
You can see the scale. Yeah, exactly. Okay, so so why is that? So your argument is that.
No, I'm always surprised.
Or you're just
I'm not making
intrigued by
I'm surprised that it's so short-lived, and also that it reflected a society.
Well, because it was an imposition.
I suppose it reflected a society that was short-lived, and it was about a small group who were the elite, and then the absolute poverty in the back streets was the worst slums in Europe. And in the 19th century, you know, cholera, shocking conditions, really shocking conditions. And then the south side, actually, the South Georgian core survived because it was more middle class.
Yeah.
Fitzwilliam Square was built much later, maybe it's 1830, I think. And it was built for medics, you know, doctors, and it survived. And Marion Square, I guess that was on a different estate, the Fitzwilliam estate, but the Gardner estate went down.
So I wonder when you said in that email that, oh, you know, I might not be the right person because, you know, I've kind of parted ways, and I wonder what is that kind of departure? You know, I'm just interested in how would you articulate that departure from a certain, I guess, certain school of thought or a tradition. Is it that looking west? Is it that looking into the landscape or land, or maybe like away from the city? I mean, it's interesting because you're sort of saying that, but I wonder whether that is the departure, or in some other ways it's manifested in maybe the architecture that you've built since.
Probably the departure has come slowly, you know. It's only looking now I realise, oh yes, I've departed from that. Because I'm still very interested in architecture and buildings, and in the making of things. I suppose I feel that, you know, architects can be very much like this, you know, we're looking this way at things, and that we've come to a time where we have got to look up and say, well, wait a minute, you know, what is the environment and context that we're building in a quite a broad way. But I mean, good architects always think about context anyway. I was thinking about the other day, because you were coming, I was remembering that I was in third year when Shane was we called them studio masters in those days.
It's still called that at the AA.
Is it?
So when I tell someone I'm a unit master,
they're
like, what? What does that mean?
I know it sounds a bit weird now, but in those days it didn't. I was also very influenced, of course, by, you know, Yvonne Farrell and Shelley McNamara, because they were teaching when I first was a student, and they were the only women teaching, and it was a real, you know, it was a great thing for girls we were in the minority then very much, and to have two teachers who were women. So that was great. And
so, sorry, you were saying how you were thinking. I
was thinking about the fact that I took a year out after fourth year, and when I came back then into fifth year, I was in California, Boston, California, and California, and I did a joint thesis with a friend and colleague, Anne Lynch. We're still friends. And I think I said to someone once, you know, that when we left, so I started in UCD in, I think it was 1975, and at that time we were really hearing about the modernist architects, you know, it was Le Corbusier, Kahn, but Kahn is sort of on the edge there, Mies and so on, you know, all of that. By the time I came back in 1980, the school had changed. It had become much more influenced by the postmodern. At the time, was kind of raging. It was a bit late for UCD, but it was. And
so that's when you came back to your fifth year.
To fifth year, I was coming back into my final year, and Anne and I designed. We decided to do a joint thesis, and we designed a sports complex on the River Liffey. Out, not in the city, but out in Island Bridge, which is a sort of it's kind of a suburb now, but it's really quite much more. It's the landscape, really. It's out in the landscape. And Shane was our tutor. And everybody else in the class, it seemed to me. So I ended up in the same class as people like Valerie Mulvin and Niall McCullough and Ray Ryan. You may know those people or have heard of them. Yeah, Ray Ryan is a critic, and he runs the. I think he's still in Pittsburgh. He is involved in that museum there. Everybody else was designing buildings and producing drawings on little plans with the elevations around, very much in the kind of postmodern, it's sort of the, looking back to the Renaissance, postmodernist style. And we seem to be out on a different track altogether. And I remember at our final review, Anne and I did these huge big drawings of the River Liffey, and it was a very ambitious project, and we were sort of not able for it, really. But it was completely different to what everybody else was doing, because we had, we'd been away for a year, and the staff had changed, and it was just, we were out of sync. I remember at the final review, and in those days, final reviews were big events. They're not now in UCD, I don't know about in the AA, but all of the staff would be there, lots of students would be there, even relatives of the students who were being credited and so on. It's a big event, and in those days the visiting critics were, I remember, Izzy Metzstein and Andy Macmillan. I don't know if you know them, you probably don't, but they were teaching in the Glasgow School of Art, and they were ferocious critics, as people were in those days. You just wouldn't do it now, but they were very, they were terrific, but they were also really
brutal.
Yes, brutal. And Izzy Metzstein was just demolishing everybody who came in front of him. And so it comes to our turn, and he goes completely, he said, he has a Scottish accent, it defies criticism, it's cinematic. Because we had done these big drawings of the river, and
it's lovely.
Yeah, it was. We just couldn't believe it, because we weren't getting much support for the project.
From
because
Shane.
It was so. No, Shane was supporting us because he was our tutor. But so you would have.
So in what sense was it different? The scale, the kind of.
It was the scale.
That it was more strategic and broad and.
Yes, and because maybe in those days people didn't do things like that now, whereas now they would. And because it was all about the river. It was about the natural world, and it wasn't because people were designing buildings, libraries, and museums, and all of the things that students do for their final. You can choose what you want to do, and this was probably off center, and maybe we were. I think we probably bit off more than we could chew, but we were in a different world. I suppose that, looking back on that, I realised we were in a different world then, and then later I became more interested in that, in looking with a broader, looking at things more widely, let's say.
And you said you came back from America, and would that have impacted, or was that was just kind of reaction to something?
So I had worked in Boston for a small firm during the summer in Central Square, which is just beside Harvard, and then went to California, and I was working for an architect in San Francisco, but Anne and others were working as bicycle couriers.
Okay.
And I realized that they were having a lot more fun than I was having. And also, they were having a real education on the city.
Right.
both the layout of the city and understanding how the city was organised.
Right.
And they were getting in, because they were bicycle messengers, they were getting into all of the buildings downtown, you know, because you would...
to deliver.
Yeah. So I quit my job and joined them. So we were getting an education, but it wasn't a kind of... It was an architectural education and an urban education, but not within the usual strictures. It certainly wasn't academic. It was in the real world of the city.
Right.
You know.
That explains the network, kind of, the understanding of a network and understanding city as a much wider...
Well, it's the difference between trying to negotiate the city on a bicycle and looking at it on a plan, you know. Or reading about it.
I mean, a bicycle is an it's I remember cycling for the first time in London, and I didn't cycle until maybe 3 years ago.
Yeah.
It completely changed my perspective because it's the speed.
Yeah.
Suddenly, like I walked a lot, but suddenly the speed, you speed and the fact that you're off center, that you're now on the street rather than on the sidewalk.
Yeah.
Suddenly it shifts your perspective, and also understanding gravity. It was such a profound experience, my first cycling, because I was like, well, now actually I feel I feel the city, the section of the city, I feel it in my legs.
Yes, yes.
And I thought that was incredible.
Yes.
So you really get like a visceral understanding of the city, actually, when you
and you really understand as you say, the section or the slope, which you don't notice. You don't notice it in the car, and you don't notice it when you're walking so much. You notice it a bit when you're walking.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So did you spend time in San Francisco as well?
Yeah, that's where I was a bicycle messenger.
Okay,
I wouldn't do it in New York. I mean, it's just too horrific, the traffic. But
cycling in San Francisco, that might have been...
Yeah, well, I didn't make much money. You earn, you know, according to the number of tags you do. So, well, we got very fit.
Yeah.
It was the fittest I'd ever been. And it was a lot of fun, you know, and you really did get to know the city. So I suppose we definitely had a different perspective then.
But then also, was it this flying circus? These London tutors?
Oh yes, yeah. No, that was Chris Cross and Ed Jones.
So did they?
They were called the Flying Circus.
Yes.
I don't know why.
Because they were flying into Dublin once or twice a week.
Yeah.
They were sort of flown in to do something, but so they wouldn't have been in that.
They weren't there for that.
Yes, I wondered whether it was them who transformed the place while you were away, and suddenly it was like unrecognizable.
No, I think what transformed it in terms of was the fact that the people who later, as I said, Shelley and Yvonne were teaching when I was in first year, I think, or second year. And then the people who later became, as well as Yvonne and Shelley, Group 91, like John and Sheila and Paul Keogh, and I think Shay Cleary was already teaching before that. But those people were now teaching, and I think it was their influence. Yeah.
And and so I guess Shane was also in America working for Kahn.
Yeah.
John Marr, I understand, was with Venturi and then Scott Brown.
Yes, that's right, yeah.
And then there was the way I understand that there were quite a few people. I mean, this seems to be a reoccurring theme, right? That going away, coming back, bringing influences. So this idea of influence, I feel, to me, it was like a fitting thing to talk about when looking at Irish architecture. So I guess I wonder whether there's anything unexpected in this kind of story of influence that you would have maybe been able to see or understand, or because I think the Khan influence is visible in architecture, really, in Ireland.
Yeah, I suppose
in some way, like, you know, even the joinery, that there's such a kind of sensibility there that. But I wonder if there's anything, well, if there's any kind of other reading of how and why this culture has emerged in the way that it has.
Do you think that there's a particular kind of architectural culture in Ireland or in Dublin?
I would say so, yeah. I would say so that it's, well, I think from what I've understood, and I mean, this has been a question that I've been asking people I've been talking to, is the question of why has this emerged as a culture? Because I've started with just a presumption that there is, and that there is. It reads as a culture. I think much more than, and this is Kenneth Frampton who I was talking to, saying that in London you can't really identify a culture because it's so big and multifaceted, but here you can. And so my question was always, why? And I mean, one thing that I've noticed is that every person that I'm talking to, and I guess 99% of the people I've spoken to, have come from one school, which is the UCD. And so I understand that it's a smaller cultural environment, so of course then the culture can kind of begin to formulate itself. Because everyone's talking to one another.
Yes, and it's a very small country.
Yeah.
I mean, a very small population, so we all tend to know each other. But now there are a lot more schools of architecture. So in the future, it won't be like that. You know, we won't all be from one school. And
the newer generation, I guess, already are not taught from UCD, which is great. But I think
Peter Cody's not a UCD graduate.
Yeah.
I don't know about people like Steve Larkin. I don't know. But yes, so when I was a student, there was just what we called then Bolton Street, which is now Technical University of Dublin, and Queen's. But now there are a lot more. So the influence, I suppose Kenneth Frampton is right, but he's always been thinking about that, you know, because he came here very early on and was very much a supporter of Irish architecture and willing to see it as something apart. It's harder for someone like me to see it because I'm in the middle of it. Maybe it is the case. I mean, is it that one of the reasons why we go away and come back is because it's an island and it's a small country. And for a long time, people went away for economic reasons, you know. But also because it's so small that you want other influences. You know, you want to see what's going on in the rest of the world. And that will change too, because influence now is very different. You know, when I was a student, you were influenced by your teachers and by your friends and maybe by something you saw in the library and liked, or some building you saw. But now the whole, you know, information world is open. So students are influenced in very different ways.
I guess the economic question is an important one, because to build there has to be construction industry requiring a lot of capital, a lot of money. So it's always tied to that, and maybe and in fact probably the emergence of this architectural culture is tied to the kind of to the economic prosperity in Ireland since, I guess, the beginning of 90s.
Yes, it is tied to that. And also the younger generation are more confident because of affluence and opportunity, you know.
I guess one thing that I've noticed is that in some way there is a kind of sensibility towards the canon here, more than I would say in British schools. You know, the AA students wouldn't really know, but that's the AA is really like an isolated small universe. But they wouldn't know the kind of the subtlety of what's Miesian or what's you know, the detail, the kind of they wouldn't really understand that Mies is all about mullions on a facade, or like how a mullion aligns to a column. Like that, they wouldn't know that. They wouldn't really understand Palladio in plan, and so. But I feel like here there is still that culture of maybe understanding architecture in that way.
Yes, I mean, I think perhaps that is the case. When you first started to say that, I thought, I don't think that young people are like that here now. But then again, what I notice, because I end up teaching Erasmus students quite a lot, and international exchange students, because I'm teaching in what we call Year 4. I notice in students who come from abroad that there is a lack of awareness of what you're calling the canon, or you know, and I don't, and so I suppose I see that in the other students, less so in the UCD students, and so it must be that we are inculcating that in our teaching, maybe even without realizing it.
I think that's part of that culture that we were talking about earlier.
Yeah.
That if you design buildings with the knowledge of all of these things, then those buildings will always be in dialogue with those things, those principles. And so whether it's Grafton or Donald Toomey or because I guess here what I recognize is real kind of in all the kind of good architecture, I recognize a similar kind of sensibility, a similar sort of quality, and a real kind of understanding of detail and
yes, and a respect for craft, I suppose, and less. But more and more we feel like that sort of architecture is becoming less and less possible, right? It's a very difficult time to be an architect, I think. And so actually what's happening in the schools is that more and more people are finding that they can't actually practice and teach. And so they're teaching and doing other ways of being involved in architecture rather than act the cold face of practice. Because one of the things we did is that we put the text only in Irish and Italian. That was turned out to be quite a provocative thing to do. And
do you speak Irish? Did you yourself?
I don't, none of us, in fact. Someone said, you know, who's the Gaelgore? You know, none of us are Gaelgores, actually. I mean, we all have school Irish. But we didn't do it for that reason, you know. We had our reasons for doing it.
Of course.
Yeah. So it turned out to be quite a controversial decision, but I'm glad we did it. So on Saturday next, we've got a number of people are going to be talking as part of the panel, and Peter Cody's going to be part of it, about the question of language and the relation, you know, the relationship between why we chose to do that with the pavilion, and also the question of, again, the natural world and the Irish language and the landscape in Ireland and the language, which are very connected in so many ways, you know. Actually, this man, Manacon McGann, who's a kind of presenter and author, he he's written a number of lovely books, but this is one of them. It's words, he's going to present it. So he describes the Irish words for these various things. And
that's amazing.
yeah.
No, it does look fascinating, the language. It's just like I see it everywhere. And but there's also something weird about it. The fact that it's kind of, well, of course I understand it's part of the kind of national rebuilding project, but it is a language that not many people speak.
Not many people
Yet it's kind of so prominently.
Yeah, it's the first official language. It's interesting because so the people who came through the pavilion who were really fascinated by the idea were people like the Basques, the Welsh. I was really surprised that, for example, Slovenia, we were beside Chile. They had their text in English and Italian.
Not Spanish.
Yeah, Slovenia, had it in English and Italian, not Slovenian. So the Slovenian pavilion was very interesting. It was about the vernacular ways of the various ways how we used to conserve energy with our architecture. And they were a young group. And that's a very small country, only 2 million or something. So those people, and the Welsh, of course, were very interested. So anybody who comes from a country where they speak a minority language were very interested in the fact that we've made that, that we made that point. Because, the reality is we speak English because of the British Empire. Across the world. That's why we speak English. So in an exhibition about decolonization, it was an important point to make. But then in most of these countries, and African countries, the writers write in English.
I know.
Because some of those languages are such a small population. If you wrote in your own language, you wouldn't sell any books, and you wouldn't reach
an audience. But
this is the.
But it is interesting because that's the very subject of the festival of the Biennale was to talk about that. Well, that sounds like that sounds like a response to the brief. Yes.
I don't know. Recently, I've been involved in film, this kind of thing, in relation to, of course, the pavilion, but also this in another part of my life is involved with Zen practice, and there was a film about that, and you just have to
Zen practice. That's what the ground floor is.
That's what the ground floor is. Milk.
No, I'm good actually. I think this is fine. Yes. It's light. And Zen practice, what does it mean, Zen practice?
Well, Zen, the word Zen means meditation. And we are following Japanese. It's Japanese Zen Buddhism. But, it not necessarily religious.
No.
Needn't be religious. But it can be religious also. Yes, I've been doing that for about 30 years.
So you're teaching meditation? Is that what it is?
We also do koan study. And so koans are like, they seem to be riddles, but they're not really. The famous one is, what is the sound of one hand clapping? You might have heard that. No, you don't read any of that.
And so you teach meditation, but you also teach, but you also have, presumably, sort of conversations and about.
We have some conversations, but Zen is very much about not talking.
Not talking. And is this a group? Done in a group?
Yeah.
And is this a kind of meditation? It's obviously breathing related.
Yes, it's very much about the body, the physical body, breathing, sitting.
And has that made its way into your architectural teaching? I mean, it must have somehow,
yes,
but...
It does, but I don't know if I could be clear about in what way.
Yeah,
Yeah. But embodiment, you know. So Zen is very much about embodiment and your own life, being aware of your own life. And so architecture is very much about that as well, you know, and architecture is
also the way you talk about landscape.
Yes.
Understanding landscape as our relationship, or our relationship to the world.
Yes. In fact, the name of our center is Earth and Sky. So, you know, even what we were talking about, the thing of being in San Francisco and working as a bicycle messenger, where you're actually physically experiencing the city and experiencing the buildings in the city and how the city works. So you're not at a remove. Like when we're studying maps of the city, of course you have to do that, you know, or you're reading about the city, you're at a remove from the thing you're studying. Whereas when you're in it, you know. And this is our life, you know, in the 21st century, and particularly for people like ourselves in the academic world. There's always a tendency to be looking on instead of being in.
Absolutely.
Yeah. That's, you know, the thing about the pavilion in Search for Brazil is that that's how we're trying to communicate, that you can experience it. So it's, you know, hearing, there's a soundscape, seeing, touching, you can touch the sheep's wool, the seaweed, all of that, you know, that it is about being present, being there and
feeling it.
Yeah. I think, you know, this is the kind of thing that has become so important now. It goes alongside the addressing the challenge of the crisis is getting back to
awareness.
Awareness,
awareness, consciousness.
Yes. And so it's really good when you're looking at landscapes as well. It's this thing of being, you know, embodied in the landscape, that you can
read.
You can read it, you can feel it, you're breathing the air, you're, you know,